overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is The Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back alongside you.
Great to be back alongside you, Eugene.
Excellent. Well, good to be also here with everyone who is out there watching. Big shout out to you, and thanks for tuning in here now. And a reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube, you may want to get ready, not may, you should, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so you can get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to, so you don't have to look very far as it concerns all of the content that we are putting out here on Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. A lot of great stuff been coming out from that program recently, if I may say so myself. And if you're welcome, of course, it's the truth. I'm not just saying that, audience. I'm telling you the truth. You won't regret it. You'll be very happy you hit subscribe and then hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things you subscribe to. And if you are watching on Free Speech TV, we salute you and just continue to watch and support FSTV. And big shout out to the whole FSTV team for making it possible for us to appear there as well. Rania, are there other points you would like to raise for those who are watching?
Well, Eugene, there are some points I'd like to raise, same thing. First and foremost, please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this episode. Make sure you smash that like button, you guys. It'll help boost us in the algorithm. And also, if you appreciate independent media like Breakthrough News, you should become a Breakthrough News member if you aren't already. For as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, like this very cool mug that says Breakthrough News in its logo. I love this mug. By going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. There is no limit, though. You can give us more than $5 a month. But if you are able to, it's more important than ever to support Breakthrough News so we can keep going and growing, especially at a time when we're dealing with real neo-fascists, you guys, and the media is controlled by them. So everyone's surrounded by this like tsunami of corporate media that promotes war and right now promotes disappearing people off the streets, is lying about the genocide in Gaza. So if you support the truth and you want people to get informed, it's super important that if you're able to, you become a member of Breakthrough News.
That's a great point. And stay tuned later in the show. We actually have a segment on the new book, Propaganda, about how the police and the media lie about many things around policing and, of course, how that impacts on, the broader quote unquote security environment and how a lot of that rhetoric and that misinformation and disinformation led us to where we are right now with the current president. So very happy to have been joined by Alec Karakastanis, who is the author of Propaganda. That'll be later in the show, towards the end of the show. But to speak directly to Rania's point and also to give you a little something to look forward to as we move forward. We got a great show for you here, as we always do, so go ahead and let people know. Text them, call them, signal them from your window by waving a sign around. Whatever seems correct to you, as long as it's safe, please do alert people that we are here on the freedom side and we are moving forward. We want to start here, of course, turning our attention to just the story of our times, I guess, and that's the ongoing genocide happening in Gaza and many of the things relating to that. We are very, very honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Ruweida Amer, who is a journalist and teacher from Gaza and also contributed to the Encampments film that we put together with Breakthrough News and Watermelon Pictures. Ruweida, thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, thank you for being here from Gaza during this hard situation. So I'm so glad for this.
Well, we are really glad to have you, and it's super important. And I guess there's many things I could say, but the fact you're a teacher, I was hoping to start by asking you just, what has the impact been on students, on teachers, on educators in the context of what's happening in Gaza?
Our school stopped from the beginning of the war, so as a teacher, I don't know what's happening with my students. I don't have any connections with everyone, so some of them displaced for many places in Gaza, and some of them traveled out Gaza to trying to be safe and survive from this war. And I know recently about some of them they killed during the war, so we lost many students. So we don't have any connection with them. Just I'm trying to be connect with anyone out Gaza because sometimes I have internet, so I check if they are good, they are better, how they live during the war, the beginning of the war, because some of them traveled in the beginning of the war. Okay, so but all my students in Gaza, I didn't talk with them for a long time before. So last time I talked with my student, it was Thursday before 2 days of the war. So it's a long time, more than 16 months. I didn't meet my student. I didn't teach them science as I did for last many years. So everything is changed, okay, but also the education changed too much because there's no schools, no universities, no any education centers in Gaza Strip, and also the schools changed to tents. So this situation where our student didn't used to learn in tents. So tents, it's not good place for education, by the way. So, but our children like the education, like to learn, like to go to their schools, to take their classes. So they used to do that because we live in a long siege before the war also. So our struggle, it's not just in this war, but we live in many big situation or hard situation before the war. Okay, so the only place the children used to go is the school, so they know just the school, so they lose them during the war. So that's back it's very bad about their psychology. So my student, when I talked with them say they said, I don't know if we will back to our school, if our school is good or not. I missed my classes, I missed my students. Did you remember our student like this? Okay, so we back to our memories to be good, to have hope for our next days, because we are looking for any small thing to give uh, give us energy to complete our life. Okay, so the schools, it was so beautiful places for our students, but we lost the almost of them. So because the bombing didn't stop, so from the beginning of the war until now, and the schools changed to shelters for the displaced people, and it's not safe for the people also. So so I miss my students. I hope to back to my normal life. Always I posted on my Instagram, my Twitter. I want to back to my schools. I missed my daily routine to go to school, to meet my students, to teach them science. So I stopped this work for 16 months. So it's so hard for us, and because the bombing is not stop. I went to my school, by the way, during the ceasefire, and I saw the place it was destroyed. Okay, we need to rebuild this place, but we had hope to back to our schools during the summer if the ceasefire be continued, but the ceasefire not uh, continue continue, and we are under the bombing again and again and again. So it's so sad for us and for my students, I'm sure.
Ruweida, I wanted to ask you, you're also a journalist, and could you tell us, were you a journalist before, or is this something you started doing after the genocide in Gaza began? I'd love to hear from your personal journey on that. And then also ask someone who is doing journalism. I mean, Israel has been targeting journalists, as you know. So, is that a scary situation to be in?
Yes, it was very different between the before the war and during the war. Okay, so I used to work as journalist with my work as teacher. Okay, so I produced documentaries about our beautiful Gaza, our beautiful sites, like positive stories for young people, children. So I produced many stories before the war. Okay, but this war it was very different for me because I didn't cover any war before, okay, but this is the first time I covered the war because I need to write. I need to do anything, okay? So writing it's very important for me because I can express about um, what I feeling during this war. So it was very hard, okay? And this war it's totally different between the last wars, by the way, because we faced like different things, hunger, lack of water, lack of food. There is no safe place. You need to looking for water every time. You need to looking for food every time. You need to looking for safe place every time. You need to contact with your friends, your colleagues, your families every time. So you are under huge pressure. Okay, like you're thinking or sorry, your mind is busy every time. Okay, so you have negative energy. Okay, this is the first thing, and you have responsibility about what's happening in Gaza. You need to show to the world, no, this war is totally different. Yes, before this war, during the last wars, there is killing, there is destroying, there is everything. But this war, it was a long war, and like we live in different situation. Like we didn't used to think about the food to stay alive. We didn't see like this. We lose like all the families, okay, all the members of the families, okay, so they deleted all the life, okay, in the life, okay, so you can't know if this family you will meet them next time or not, or there is just one member of the family survive, okay, so this person will live without his family or her family. So it was so hard. So you need to work, you need to write, you need to tell the world about something. But I want to be very honest this time, or in this interview. We are working very hard during the war. We are writing hundreds of articles, producing hundreds of videos, documentaries, sharing thousands of posts to tell the world there is war in Gaza, there is people killing Gaza, there is people die because of there is hunger in Gaza, there is no water, there is no medicine, there is no safe place. But although not just me, all the people in Gaza, so there is the people are silent. There is nothing changed because the war still continue. Okay, the bombing is still every minute, every second. Okay, it's what every area in every areas in Gaza Strip. We know Gaza Strip um, too much, so we know the places. Okay, and I want to say something about this video. Last Friday, my mother like was very sick, so need needed to make a very fast operation. Okay, so we went to the hospital, but I feel the hospital is not safe. So I want to back to my place. I want to finish this operation too fast. And I told my brother I didn't feel very good when I walking around the hospital because they targeted the hospital before. So the hospital is not a place. So I don't know if it's normal for the people feel like this or not. To feel the hospital is not safe, schools not safe, international organizations not safe like this. So we need to write, we need to work, we need to show to the world, but it's not a change anything. The war is still and continue, and we take rest just for many days, but not forever. Okay, so we had hope. As I told you, we will back to our normal life. We will rebuild Gaza. We will rebuild our schools. We will back to our work. We will meet our friends, colleagues. I didn't see my colleagues for more than 16, and I say 16 months. I told them every time we will meet us, we will go to our school, we will go to our favorite places. I will meet you. Okay, it was dreams. Okay, so when the war back, we back to give us support to this war will finish, but we don't know when because every second or time. Every time it's hard for us, okay? If you want, because there's no food, as I told you, there is no water, as I told you. So every time is hard for us. It's meaning our life, okay? So I don't know if it's normal for the people to feel like this or just because we are in Gaza, it's okay to feel like this. So uh, always I said we are like civilian people, okay? We have dreams, we have futures, we have childrens, we have plans to achieve our goals, to complete our life, to work, to just to be in safe. So we need that. So I want to back to our work as journalists. I'm sorry. I like jump to another because
No, no,
really
don't apologize.
yeah, yeah, but as I told you, yes, my family didn't support me to cover and to write because they are was very worried about me. They want me to be safe. Okay, so but I don't know. Anything in Gaza you can see during the war, targeted journalists, hospitals, schools, doctors. So everyone in Gaza have story. Not me, not the journalist, doctors, teachers. So I don't know. There is no one safe. Not we are as journalists. No, all the people in Gaza. Not
Well, Ruweida, we really appreciate everything you have done and will continue to do, and for being willing to join us here amidst everything in this late hour and talk more about this. And we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future as the situation continues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean,
Rania?
what an incredible I just It really, when you hear just like the daily toll life in Gaza is taking, and I know that that doesn't even express exactly what she and so many others are enduring. It's just unbelievable. 16 months of this horror, and also we should point out, Ruweida worked on the Encampments documentary. The footage from Gaza is footage from her. So if you haven't gone to see the Encampments, please go check it out in a theater near you. You can go to the-encampments.com and find where it's playing nearest you. Super important movie, very timely. And just wow, to those who are still bringing us images and reports out of Gaza. I mean, it's one of the bravest things that can be done at the moment, given that Israel's literally trying to target everybody who is telling the world what's happening on the ground in Gaza.
No, 100%. And I appreciate that. We didn't even get to that. I mean, it just shows how deep this is. There's so many things to discuss and so much to get through. And so, we will bring Ruweida back, and we'll keep, bringing in all of our colleagues, who are reporting there from on the ground, and remember those who have lost their lives as well. The most deadliest conflict in history for journalists. Yeah. What do you even really say?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a genocide. Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, it's like sometimes I'm like, do we even keep calling it a conflict, right? I mean, yeah, it's a conflict of sorts, but it's like I don't know. I think at this point, the deliberate targeting. I mean, we don't even know how many people have been killed in Gaza. It's just unbelievable. It's a real Holocaust, and anyway. Just horrifying.
Yeah. I mean,
the repression is coming home, Eugene.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, let's go ahead and move the show forward here. And there's a lot of things happening, obviously, in the context of the tariff extravaganza, all sorts of countries being caught in the crossfire. And I think there's a lot to be said about what it says about the ability of countries in the global south to emerge from the range of crises they're continually facing, in addition to the trade war that they're now facing. And Sri Lanka is one of great interest, given what took place there at the huge mass protests that overthrew a government because of poor economic conditions. And here we are. So nonetheless, before I say too much, we are very, very happy to be joined for this segment by Sharon I'm going to get it right. Paruma, am I right? Close.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon.
Pretty close.
Okay. I'm struggling, but I appreciate you struggling here with me. You're a journalist, political economist, researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, one of my favorite people to follow on this and many topics. Thanks so much for being with us here.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. So let me just start here, maybe just for some framing for people who don't know. I mean, I think there's probably a number of people who remember the huge protest a couple years ago in Sri Lanka. I mean, evocative images, taking the presidential palace, all those different pieces. Some people may know there was an election, that a new political force was able to come into power. But, I mean, give us a sense of those two events, how related they are, and if the new government is in place is maybe an extension, perhaps, of that feeling, that mass feeling in Sri Lanka that things need to change.
Yeah, well, the protest that happened, a couple of years ago now, it was very interesting. It was in some ways quite unprecedented in Sri Lankan history. There used to be very large protests and strikes sort of by the organized left in the old days, but this is something quite different. It was, some would describe it as a spontaneous uprising based on the very severe economic conditions, right? There were very bad shortages and long queues for essentials, and people across class boundaries were suffering, right? And there was no one particular political line that united all these different people, aside from the fact that they were very unhappy with the political establishment, and they were very unhappy with the way the economy had collapsed. And there were various different factions, various different class interests that sort of played out there. Ultimately, I think it would be correct to say that the current ruling party most effectively seized upon the moment and rode that wave of anger against the establishment, right?
I'm curious when we talk about the tariffs that Trump levied against Sri Lanka. I think it was something like 44%. You wrote about how this would have the kind of immediate impact this would have, and it would definitely be devastating for Sri Lanka because its textile and apparel sector is so overwhelmingly dependent on the U.S. market. So, I mean, given these tariffs that are being imposed or were imposed until there was this pause against so many countries in the global South, like Sri Lanka, that are in such a vulnerable position. I mean, can you describe what would be the impact on a country like Sri Lanka? And I think that we could almost extrapolate, I mean, not the exact scenario, but how devastating this would be for so many countries across the global South if they were to actually be impacted with the tariffs he wants to impose.
So for context, I mean, Sri Lanka basically just came out of the, official default status, the sovereign default status, right? And that was a product of a very protracted debt restructuring agreement brokered by the IMF. It entailed a lot of very painful austerity measures, which, the previous government was more than happy to do. And in fact, one of the promises of the current government was to sort of try and renegotiate those conditions. Unfortunately, they haven't gone ahead with that particular campaign promise. The main impact for Sri Lanka is the fact that we are just so dependent on the US market. It's kind of almost unusual in the Asian context where so many economies have integrated further into Asia and reoriented themselves more and more towards China, whereas Sri Lanka, almost a quarter of our exports go to the United States. What's really ironic is that Trump, in a way, seems to be acting out against the previous era of US-led globalization, right? And the interests that he represents say that that has been harmful to the US. But Sri Lanka is a very good example of a country that is basically a product of that previous era of US-led globalization. The entire intention of that was to make countries like Sri Lanka basically dependent on the Western market, to depend on Western technologies and Western investment, and to keep us locked in at a very low stage of the value chain, right? So, we produce very labor-intensive products for the US market, and we have not been able to climb out of that position. So from a Sri Lankan perspective, when, people like Trump say that the global trade system is, rigged and it's not in favor of the US, that's complete bogus. The current trade system was basically designed by the US elite. There are contradictions within it, for sure, which is, and Trump is a symptom of those contradictions, right? But it's very interesting that, Sri Lanka is one of the many countries in the global South that was basically thrown under the bus by this US-led globalization. And now, as Trump seeks to sort of fix those contradictions for the contradictions that the US is facing, it's just creating even more problems for us over here in Sri Lanka.
Well, and it seems like it's a difficult situation for Sri Lanka as well, because even the sort of, if you have the will to reorient, Sri Lanka seems really caught in the cross currents of the new Cold War aspect of this as well. Beyond this, the tariffs, of course, obviously India, which is another neighbor, which has its own relationship with China, the United States, that obviously seems to have deep fears that Sri Lanka is going to become like a base for China, as it may be, that even sort of trying to navigate how to find a way to pivot out of the U.S. market seems to also leave a country like Sri Lanka still in the crosshairs, in other regards.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. I mean, there's no real short-term fix to the issues that Sri Lanka faces because, even everyone who works in the private sector, the main sort of private sector lobbyists that represent the interests of these major exporters that rely on the Western markets, they're very clear that their opinion is that there is no alternative to the US market, right? As far as they're concerned, this is what they know, this is what they're used to. They're used to working with the US, and they would basically pressure the government to give as many concessions as possible to keep that market open, which is, I think, exactly what Trump wants, basically. I mean, he knows that a lot of the weaker countries in the global South that have a very powerful comprador sector, he knows that these people are going to be pushing the local government to give as many concessions as possible so that they can still have that lifeline, that access to the Western market, which, keeps them going. But that might not necessarily be in the long-term national interest of a country in the global South like Sri Lanka.
And also, you draw this powerful contrast between the IMF's treatment of a country like Sri Lanka versus the way the US treated West Germany after World War II. And I thought this was interesting because it really speaks to the global financial system we have today. And of course, we know the role of the institutions like the IMF in perpetuating that inequality between the global north and the global south. Could you speak a bit to that? Because I think it's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, that is a very interesting example. I came across this through the research done by two Indian economists, Jayati Ghosh and C.P. Chandrasekhar, and they have written about this quite a few times, basically about how in the beginning of the Cold War, basically after World War II, when Germany was experiencing a massive debt crisis, the response from the Allies was basically to cancel their debt and to make sure that whatever debts that they had to pay would be pegged to their exports, right? So you'd have to actually earn export revenue in order to pay back that debt. In Sri Lanka's case, that is, completely not an option, right? Debt cancellation, it's a no-go. It's not even being talked about in any serious way. If you talk about it, you're sort of characterized as a kind of crazy leftist. And then on the other hand, it's the IMF's approach to debt restructuring in Sri Lanka is very interesting, in the sense that it only looks at GDP. It doesn't look at your debt stock in relation to your foreign currency earnings, right? It's almost as if it's designed to just keep the country in debt in perpetuity, right? To keep forcing us to go into the international bond market and keep borrowing from these Western financial companies like BlackRock and so on. In an ideal world, there would be a much better, more robust debt restructuring mechanism for countries like Sri Lanka. And it would not just entail austerity, but it would have a program of investment, maybe something equivalent to, the Marshall Plan, which Europe had. That is really what's needed to actually grow out of the debt, if not cancel it entirely, to invest in productive capacities and to invest in producing the things people actually need so that, Sri Lanka can stand on its own 2 feet as a player in the international arena.
No, I think it's a good point, and obviously there's a tricky circumstance. I mean, I know they recently passed a budget, and there's different moves that have been happening. I mean, are there baby steps that could or have been taken by the current government, in this direction? And I know this is a big piece of what you all have done at Tricon is sort of showing the impact of industrialization and investment in infrastructure and things like that, and helping countries lift off. So, are we seeing any green shoots, so to speak?
At the moment, to be perfectly honest, I don't see it. I mean, the government is really sandwiched in a sense, because the IMF guardrails are so strong, and I think if you look at what has happened to Sri Lanka the past few years, it's almost been made an example of, because the elites have. And when I say elites, I don't mean the political elites. I mean pretty much the economic elites, right? The private sector have shown the sheer amount of power they wield, right? So if the government was to go into a very, let's say, interventionist direction, right, to try and clamp down on the freedoms of the private sector, a lot of these traders, importers, merchants, these comprador factions, they have a lot of power. They can just not repatriate their profits. They can crash the currency. They can cause all sorts of issues. And that's not even talking about the hybrid war tactics that, a country like the US can wage. I mean, we've seen how that plays out in so many different countries across the world, right? What I hear from people in the government is often they say that they would like to do more, but they can't. I mean, if I'm being a bit critical, I think it requires a certain amount of courage and imagination from the side of, quote unquote progressive policymakers to actually make those hard decisions. Because for a lot of these countries in global south, including Sri Lanka, there's no easy way out. There's no smooth way out of these contradictions. Like, there has to be a break at some point, and there has to be hard decisions made in terms of geopolitics, geopolitical alignments, in terms of different class interests in the country. You can't please everyone forever. Eventually, you've got to take a side. And I think we're coming closer and closer to the point where it'll be evident where this government will come to a position where it really needs to make a decision and take a side, because the economic crisis is coming, whether we like it or not, right?
No.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point to make. I was talking with friends. So I live in Lebanon. I was talking to friends about this today. Lebanon's a very different case. Doesn't really have an economy or produce anything the way that like a country like Sri Lanka does. But in a country like Lebanon, because it has such a weak economy, it's really under the American boot. It has no option but to follow U.S. dictates as just a very, very weak country in the global south. But it'll be interesting to see how countries that have a little bit more leverage will respond to this America basically forcing them to choose sides between the U.S. and China is ultimately what they're trying to do, in the long run. And I guess I'm just kind of commenting, not really a question if you want to add anything to that. But I did want to ask, because you mentioned the issue of China and China's ability to withstand some of this. What did China do that was correct that other countries can learn from? Though I understand other countries in the global south can't necessarily do exactly what China did. But and moreover, you make this point about how the issue is that it's unacceptable for China to have an alternative that isn't based or centered around the U.S. And that's why, it needs to be attacked. I think that is an interesting point to take in here, because at the end of the day, it's just unacceptable for the U.S. to accept equal footing with any country that it deems lesser than it, which is most of the world.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point. I think a lot of people have pointed out the fact that U.S.-China relations were great when China was just doing labor-intensive sort of outsourced manufacturing. But the minute they start climbing up the value chain, that is a problem, right? And well, that's exactly what China has done right. They have consistently focused on a massive amount of investment in their own country, in their own people, in their own infrastructure. They have maintained public control over land, over the financial sector, over critical elements of trading, for example. I think they've been more proactive than most countries in the global south in terms of preventing the development of a strong politicized comprador element, right, in their polity and their political system. I mean, it's ruled by a communist party. It's designed to work in that way. That's basically, in my opinion, in short, what they have done right. I mean, for the US, I think that would be a dangerous example if other countries look at China and sort of start getting the wrong idea.
I think you are very right about that. Well, we'll have to leave it there. There's a lot more to say. Sharon Ilan-Peruma from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Really appreciate you joining us and looking forward to talking to you in the future.
Thanks, guys.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, I think we're going to have a lot more to talk about when it comes to this, because this tariff chaos is not over.
No.
It's just the beginning.
Indeed it is. Well, let's turn to another massive issue, and that is immigration here in the United States, which, has so many different facets to it, but really an all-out assault in many ways by the Trump administration on immigrant communities. We are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, who's a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council. Aaron, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, great for having you here. I mean, obviously there's so much to say and so much that could be said. I mean, maybe let's just start here. I mean, I know that the Supreme Court has kept, I guess, they're setting arguments for in about a month from now, I think, about the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. And it just feels like an important place to start, because it just seems amazing to me that we're really considering, a significant change to one of the most significant progressive pieces of legislation in this country, the 14th Amendment. I mean, what does that say about where we are in terms of immigration policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even say that the 14th Amendment is immigration policy. The 14th Amendment is the bedrock principle that on which much of the post-Civil War era rests. This idea that any person born in the United States is a citizen. It's important for people to understand that the Supreme Court agreed to take a much more narrow challenge. Mostly this is going to be about procedural issues, about whether or not nationwide injunctions are appropriate here. But, I cannot think of a better case for nationwide injunctions. The idea that you would have a person's citizenship changing depending on if they stepped across a state line is ridiculous. And so this may be a case where the Supreme Court narrows nationwide injunctions and sets a harder standard for judges to meet, but then says, of course, that standard is met here. Because really, if this isn't it, I don't see what possibly ever could justify a nationwide injunction. But, as you said, the fact that the Trump administration is even trying to undermine the 14th Amendment in the first place is really troubling.
I mean, Aaron, there's so much to ask you about here, and thank you so much for your Twitter account, because it's been very useful in understanding all these moving parts of just the most insane stories ever. Let's start with this prison in El Salvador, because Bukele was here this week at the White House. Some insane things were said. I mean, as is the case every day. This man is one of the many people they sent to this prison in El Salvador based literally on tattoos. Like, it's just so insane. You can't make this up. They're saying that this man needs to be brought back to the U.S. because he was denied due process rights. The Trump administration is saying, no, we're not going to do that. And not only that, but they're saying that they're going to start going after naturalized citizens and perhaps send them to El Salvador prison camps if they've committed violent crimes. So I just said a lot there, but like, for people who are confused and don't really understand what's going on, can you explain why this is also like insane?
Yeah, there's a lot of chum that's being thrown in the water about these cases. But at its core, this is about due process and the rule of law. Can the U.S. government send someone to be not just deported, but imprisoned in a foreign nation with no due process at all? And the answer to that, as the courts have unanimously held, is no. Nothing in U.S. law permits the U.S. government to pay another nation to imprison someone. And, you looking at this, there's a few different things going on here. There's the case of Mr. Abrego Garcia from Maryland, who's been here since 2011, married to a U.S. citizen. The government accuses him of being an MS-13 on the basis of a police gang information worksheet, gang field information sheet that was filled out in 2019 by a cop, suspended 2 weeks later for massive professional misconduct that he was later prosecuted for. So a dirty cop. And that is the only source of the MS-13 allegations. But setting that aside, the core thing is he shouldn't have been deported to El Salvador. He won protection in 2019, and that protection said the only country that he could not be deported to was El Salvador. And they did, by their own admission, by mistake. But his case is different than that of the Venezuelans sent there, who were deported under the Alien Enemies Act, which is a whole other different legal thing that the Trump administration is violating. But in all cases, these men have been sent to CECOT, the Centro Confinamiento de Terrorismo, the Terrorism Confinement Center, which is a mega prison that is run by Salvadoran President Bukele, where individuals are held essentially in large groups with no access to the outside world. This is a prison that is harsher than the harshest supermax prison in the United States, the places that we send serial killers and terrorists. And these are people who have never been convicted of a crime, many of them who seem to be completely innocent and who were sent there on allegations of gang membership never proven to anyone that seem very flimsy on the face of it, including Andre Hernandez, who has 2 tattoos on his arms. One says mom, the other says dad. And because they had 2 little crowns over them, the Trump administration, well, actually the Biden administration originally thought he was a member of Tren de Aragua, but the Trump administration sent him to be imprisoned. So, you can talk about this issue in so many different ways, but I think honestly, the best way to look at this actually came down in a federal court decision issued just moments ago. The Fourth Circuit just rejected a request by the Trump administration to put the proceedings in Mr. Abrego Garcia's case on hold. And Judge Wilkinson, who is a Reagan appointee, a known conservative on the court, said this: If today the executive claims the right to deport without due process and in disregard of court orders, what assurance will there be tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens and then disclaim responsibility to bring them home? And what assurance shall there be that the executive will not train its broad discretionary powers upon its political enemies? And I think Judge Wilkinson gets right to the core there.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Oh, sorry. I just wanted to ask one quick thing because I've been dying to understand the implications of this. Because as you just said, there's a recent court order that came down. Despite multiple court orders, right? This administration has not facilitated the return of this Maryland man. They haven't been following other court orders as well. What legal mechanisms exist to enforce these judicial decisions? And if they're ignored, are there implications? Because I'm starting to feel like it seems like Trump can kind of just get away with not listening.
Yeah, so the obvious way to enforce these orders is contempt of court. And we have already seen Judge Boasberg in the Alien Enemies Act case about the Venezuelans find that the government likely engaged in contempt of court. He determined that there was probable cause to hold them in criminal contempt of court. And he even suggested that if they continued, this is because they didn't turn the planes around on March 15th in violation of his orders. And he suggested that he might actually appoint a special prosecutor that could prosecute members of the government. And it's true with criminal contempt, ultimately at the end of the day, it is hard to enforce that if the government does not want to comply. And President Trump could theoretically just pardon people for criminal contempt of court. But this sets up a constitutional crisis if something like that were to happen. This is a serious issue where we have the judiciary finding that the government is just flagrantly ignoring its commands. And will this actually result in arrest? The first time maybe I think in American history that a judge held the government in criminal contempt and had them arrested. There have been a couple warrants issued before, but the Supreme Court's usually stepped in. There's about 3 or 4 cases in U.S. history where judges have tried to hold government officials in contempt of court for not following court orders. But almost always they do because they understand that they have to. And so we are in a pretty worrying moment where that is a real possibility that they might not. But so far, they have been essentially trying to find loopholes around it. And today's decision by the Fourth Circuit to reject that first attempt is yet another sign that the judiciary is not budging. In Mr. Abrego Garcia's case, it has been unanimous. Not a single federal judge has ruled in the Trump administration's favor. Not one. And so how long are they going to be able to keep stonewalling this? It's hard to say. But again, Judge Wilkinson, who again, a Reagan appointee and a conservative, he ended his decision today with a plea to the Trump administration to stop doing this. He said the branches are coming close to grinding irrevocably against one another in a conflict that promises to diminish both. This is a losing proposition all around. And he is essentially saying, President Trump, you can fix this. You do not have to get into this position where you are disobeying our court orders. You can just follow what every president has done in the past when they got a court order they didn't like, follow it, appeal it to the Supreme Court, see what they do. And if you lose, you've lost. That's how our system of government works. And unfortunately, Judge Wilkinson clearly sees that he needs to remind Trump of that.
Yeah, no, well, it's quite the situation. I mean, it feels, to speak to the point you were making there about Judge Wilkinson's decision, I think, there's one set of aspect of this is just because someone is not a citizen, should they be subjected to various different things? But I mean, it does seem when you think about, taking forward the case that in many ways kind of set this whole thing off with Mahmoud Khalil, that there's also this sort of thought crime element to this as well, where, the sort of conflation of speech and thought with crimes, could easily also be carried over, it seems to me, to citizens as well. Like if you say someone saying something means they're a supporter of Hamas when they're not a citizen, how far do you have to go to say the same thing if they are?
Yeah, I think with Mr. Khalil's case, the reality is what Mr. Rubio has done, Secretary Rubio has done, is unfortunately it's lawful under U.S. immigration laws. And then the question there is whether those laws are unconstitutional. We might not get an answer to that for quite some time. But this is because immigration laws are inherently different than a lot of other laws because they are about people that don't have exactly the same rights. And while it's true that they don't have exactly the same rights. They still do have rights. They're still protected under the First Amendment. They still have a right to due process. They have a lot of rights inherent in the law in our Constitution. But the government does have quite a lot of authority. It's known as the plenary power over immigration, and it allows Congress to pass laws which would be totally unconstitutional if applied to U.S. citizens, which might theoretically be constitutional if applied to non-citizens. So in Mr. Khalil's case, I think there is certainly a concern for other non-citizens. I'm not sure if the issue situation is there in immigration law. The bigger issue is what they're trying to do with Harvard and others, which is strip them of their status, take away their rights to host foreign students, get rid of their tax-exempt status, all of these other laws which they can use to weaponize. But when we look at Mr. Khalil's case, we've also seen anti-terrorism laws being potentially weaponized because the Trump administration has labeled MS-13 a terrorist organization, which personally I disagree with. I think they are a heinous transnational criminal organization, but that's not the same thing as a political terrorist organization. Their aims are profit and money and power, not necessarily political aims. But setting that aside, we see Sebastian Gorka, who is actually now in the government at the Counterterrorism Center, suggest that people who supported Mr. Abrego Garcia should be prosecuted for aiding and abetting a terrorist. So that is something that I could see them weaponizing, less so immigration law.
I'm also curious if you could comment on this recent development. There's an American citizen that was detained in Georgia. And I don't know the exact details. I was actually kind of catching up before we started. Oh, in Florida. I'm sorry. Detained, but also by ICE. And this person's mother in court brought the birth certificate and the social security number to be like, no, this is an American citizen. But ICE is insisting on holding this person. What on earth is happening there?
Yeah, so I can break through. I don't have a ton of information on this. I'll share what I know about this case. A lot is more coming out. This is a person who was born in the U.S., but lived most of his life in Mexico, came back to the U.S. 4 years ago, so he might not speak great English. He was arrested actually by Florida police under a new Florida law, which makes it a crime for an undocumented immigrant to enter the state. So local police in Tallahassee thought that he was an undocumented immigrant. He's not. He's a U.S. citizen. I don't know why they thought that. I have certainly plenty of ideas, but I don't want to speculate too publicly on that. But when he went to court, he actually ended up being charged with this law for entering Florida as an undocumented immigrant. That's problematic for a couple of reasons. First off, he's not an undocumented immigrant. He's a U.S. citizen. And secondly, because that law is actually on hold. A federal judge a couple of weeks ago issued an injunction blocking the government of Florida from enforcing this law. And clearly that message did not filter down to prosecutors in Tallahassee. So in court, actually, the judge, the Tallahassee state judge, municipal judge, I'm not sure which Florida locality was doing this, looked at his birth certificate and said, yeah, you seem to be a U.S. citizen, and dismissed the charges. So he's no longer being held on Florida law, but what he is being held on now is an ICE hold, because ICE has tagged him as potentially undocumented. And this is a great example of the ways that U.S. citizens occasionally get picked up by ICE, usually database issues or some sort of local person who just doesn't believe that this guy who doesn't speak English is actually a U.S. citizen. And according to the Government Accountability Office, which issued a report in 2021, at least 100 people a year get arrested or have ICE holds put on them who are actually U.S. citizens. So it's not certainly unique. This isn't a situation we've never seen before, but what is unique is this use of this Florida law. We're seeing states now trying to carry out immigration enforcement, and the very first use of the law was on a U.S. citizen.
Wow. I mean, there's
Incredible.
so much there.
Wow. I mean, I know it's just so
there's
insane.
A preliminary injunction. Yeah, there's a preliminary injunction hearing in that case tomorrow. And I'm sure the litigation team will be going to the federal judge and saying, look, if you ever needed proof that this law is going to cause problems, here it is.
I just have one last thing to say here, Aaron. I know we're a bit out of time, but I do think that it's a really kind of scary moment right now. I mean, I was just in the States. I'm an American citizen, but I felt a little panicked coming into the country. I keep telling people who aren't citizens, like, maybe now's not the best time to go there, because it seems there's obviously a lot of political persecution happening. There's some targeted persecution happening towards specific kinds of people based on certain attributes. But there's also some random stuff happening, which it just seems like ICE agents have been sort of given a blank check to just be jerks to whoever they feel like being a jerk to. I mean, that's speculation on my part, but I'm just curious. Is this for you as somebody who's an immigration lawyer? Is this unprecedented? Is this a scary moment where you would be telling people maybe be a little bit more careful about coming into the U.S.?
Yeah, it's always hard to figure out what's anecdotes and media paying attention to things that's always been happening or what is actually a new pattern. But certainly, there's a great phrase, anecdata. So the anecdata right now suggests that at the very least, there's been a vibe shift within the government. And inside the country with ICE and other things, what we are seeing is a massively ramped up enforcement. But even massively ramped up enforcement, when you're talking a population of 13 to 15 million undocumented immigrants, is still a tiny fraction of that population. But what is happening is that there's a climate of fear. And the Trump administration is deliberately inculcating that climate of fear because they want to encourage people to self-deport. And I think that's why you see them taking out ads on Fox News. That's why you see them blasting all of these operations across social media. DHS Secretary Noem going in person to these operations. They want to give people, especially undocumented immigrants, the sense that ICE is right over their shoulders and is going to get them any minute. So you might as well leave now. And that is something that's having a bigger effect. You've got many U.S. citizens, naturalized U.S. citizens worried about it. You've got green card holders worried about it. Just a lot of people worried about maybe the government's going to come for me. And I think that is the biggest issue that's happening right now. Even if individual anecdotes, we can't necessarily say that they're a result of government policy changes.
Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Well,
Wow.
a lot to be said there. But let's say it another time. Let's move right into our next segment here. There's a lot happening from Ecuador to Argentina in South America, and you may not be surprised to know we've brought in the expert, Zoe Alexandra, journalist and editor of People's Dispatch, to help us cover them all. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, great to have you. I'll start with Ecuador, which recently just had a presidential election, which I guess has had the outcome is not clear. I mean, we know one person is the victor in a technical sense, like he has assumed power, but perhaps not in a real sense of the actual ballots. So, I mean, maybe just give us a sense of what took place this past Sunday in the runoff presidential election there in Ecuador.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly the correct way to characterize it. It's sort of a inconclusive electoral result. So incumbent President Daniel Noboa, who, just to remind your viewers and listeners, he is the son of the richest man in Ecuador, part of the kind of banana fortune. He is also one of the youngest presidents in Ecuador. He was elected president in this kind of crazy moment in Ecuadorian politics when Guillermo Lasso had activated the cross-death mechanism amid a massive corruption scandal. So he's only been in office for just over a year, during which there's been essentially state of emergency declared the whole time. But that aside, Ecuador went to the polls back in February. This was the first round of the elections to elect, again, the parliament and new president. And in these elections, there was a result that was quite different than other first rounds presidential elections had. And this was the fact that Daniel Noboa, incumbent president, and Luisa Gonzalez of the Citizens Revolution were essentially neck and neck. They were essentially tied. In previous electoral processes in the first round, the first place person you would usually take around 30%. There's many candidates in the first round of the electoral process. The other candidates would take maybe 20%, then 10%. It was much more of a possibility of representing different political currents that then in the second round would, of course, come down between two candidates. But in the first round of these elections, it was, there was a difference of percentage points between Daniel Noboa, who's on screen right now, and Luisa Gonzalez, who's from the progressive movement of the Citizens Revolution Party, which comes out of course, Rafael Correa, former president. And so heading into the second round, it was very clear that the race on April 13th was going to be very close. And it was going to be a dispute and a race for every single vote. And what happened this Sunday is that, leading up to it, again, all of the opinion polls showing Luisa and Daniel neck and neck. She won considerable endorsements from major sections of Ecuadorian society, namely from the Pachakutik party, which is the electoral arm of CONAIE, which is the largest indigenous confederation in Ecuador. And for those of you who are familiar with the mass mobilizations that Ecuador has seen in the past decade, oftentimes led by CONAIE, made up again of these different indigenous peoples and their organizations across the country. Luisa Gonzalez received support from CONAIE. She received support also from centrist groups and sectors. So it seemed like a lot was going in her favor. And the opinion polls leading up to the elections were showing that. And we're not just saying that these opinion polls said this and then the election results didn't happen, but there was legitimate sectors of society that said we're going to vote for this candidate. And Sunday comes around and the results start to come out, and it's showing that Daniel Noboa is ahead by a significant amount, an amount that was not shown neither in the opinion polls ahead of the race or in the exit polls. And eventually, the National Electoral Council of Ecuador declared that he had won the polls with about 56%, and Luisa Gonzalez, of course, trailing behind him. Again, several percentage points behind. And immediately, and even when the first results started to come out, there was kind of this sense of uneasiness amongst the progressive camp. And leading up to these elections, it's important to point out that even before any instance of electoral fraud may or may not have taken place on April 13th, Daniel Noboa had already violated many different electoral laws. For example, he, again, as I mentioned, had been president for the last year and a half. And under electoral law in Ecuador, when you're running for a position and you are an elected official, you have to resign for the campaign period, because otherwise you're essentially, you would be using state resources for your campaign. Daniel Noboa not only did not do that, but he used state resources to, for example, award different bonuses and checks to underprivileged and underserved communities in an effort, of course, one can only assume, to increase his likelihood of winning the second round. And so a lot of irregularities have been pointed out. On Sunday, after the results came in, Luisa Gonzalez, in a mass rally, announced to the media and announced to the Ecuadorian people that in her opinion, in the opinion of the Citizens Revolution, a grotesque fraud had taken place, one of the worst ones, she said, in Ecuador's recent history, in the history of it being a republic. And that they were not going to recognize the results. And since then, of course, Daniel Noboa has said, I recognize the results. There is no fraud that took place. But we've seen that the international reaction has been divided. For example, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has said that she does not think that these results are valid. Mexico, of course, has suspended relationships with Ecuador since Daniel Noboa himself ordered a Ecuadorian police to invade the Mexican embassy in Quito in order to arrest Jorge Glass, who had been granted political asylum. So Claudia Sheinbaum, a major player in Latin American politics, has said she would not recognize it. Gustavo Petro, Colombian president, has said that he also thinks that what happened on Sunday does point to electoral fraud, and offered political asylum to people from the Citizen Revolution who are now being persecuted. So at the moment, Daniel Noboa has still claimed that this was valid, that the National Electoral Council results are correct, but there is still some ambiguity, there's some division, and the Citizen Revolution movement has said that they will continue to demand that there be a recount and that these results be kind of made invalid.
The international division is quite important to point out, Zoe. I also wanted to ask, the election was conducted under the state of emergency in several provinces, with the military playing a pretty significant role in overseeing the process. And of course, critics have argued that this may have compromised the fairness of the election. So I'm curious, what are your insights into how that state of emergency and that military involvement may have influenced voter turnout and the overall integrity of the electoral process?
Yeah, this is another key reason why many people have questioned the outcome of the election. And it's important to point out that since January 2024, basically all of Ecuador has been in a constant state of emergency, with Noboa having declared a civil war in the country and a war against criminal groups. And this has meant that for the past year and a half, almost, year and 4 months, Ecuador has been in a state of essentially constant and intensified militarization of the territory. And so not only is there an increase in number of, police officers you may see on the street, but also now there's actual military deployed across Ecuadorian territory. And this has had horrible consequences. Like we know, in December, there were 4 young Afro-Ecuadorian boys who were kidnapped by the military, disappeared, and found incinerated days later. And so this military presence in the country has had real impacts on people's lives, has already caused fatal victims, and of course has a chilling effect on people's participation in a democratic process. Having a state of emergency and an internal conflict for over a year and 4 months means that, there isn't, life as usual is not as it is. People are not living in sort of a free country. They're not living under normal circumstances. And this, of course, impacts how they interact with, electoral process, democratic process. And of course, there's doubts, there's, considerations to be raised about the fact that the military were overseeing the polls, that they were overseeing, many different aspects of the electoral process. That is, of course, an irregularity in how the elections should be run in the country.
No, I think it's an important issue, and yeah, there's so much to be said about all of this in Ecuador, which we'll have to keep talking about and coming back to. But I also want to touch on Argentina because something pretty significant happened, I think kind of flew under the radar. The foreign exchange restrictions were lifted. At the same time, a $20 billion IMF loan was given out, which is amazing because Milei said the IMF was like a Soviet-inspired institution when he was running for office. Just like he also said he hated China, but it seems like when people start handing out free money, he starts to change his position. But that being said, I mean, talk about the significance of this for the living standards. I mean, you all recently had a video on People's Dispatch of some extreme police brutality against senior citizens, primarily protesting against the deep decline of the living standards. So how does this maybe positively or negatively affect what seems to be a pretty tough economic situation for Argentines?
Well, Milei ran on a platform saying that he was going to combat the political caste, that he was going to stop inflation, that he was going to dissolve the central bank, that he was going to dollarize the economy, and essentially, pull everyone out of economic misery. And he came into office in December. It's been, a year and 5 months now. Of course, none of that has happened because he's, unwilling to take the measures that are necessary to actually alleviate the structural issues in the Argentinian economy. For example, he has, of course, had another negotiation with the IMF, and as a result has taken out this $12 billion loan once again. And, the Argentinian economy is one that is really dominated by the dollar. And if you look at its history over the past, several decades, this has been a determining factor in people's living standards. In other countries in the global south, monitoring the exchange rate with the dollar might not be kind of like the main determinant of people's economic well-being, but in Argentina, it really has been. And one of the key indicators of the economic health of the country is whether or not they're able to kind of sustain a low devaluation rate. And for the first year, it seemed that Milei was trying his hardest to maintain this low rate, not letting the dollar kind of gain too much strength. And that of course needs more dollars to be in Argentina. And essentially what happened on Friday, there was a televised announcement by Milei on national TV saying we're going to lift this restriction on how many dollars people can buy, and lift this kind of exchange rate cap. And essentially, this can send the dollar into free fall. Many more people can buy dollars, and it does have an impact on people's livelihoods. This increases the prices. And in the past several days, I was just looking at some numbers before getting on here. There has been, not only has the peso went from 1,000 pesos to the dollar to 1,200 pesos to the dollar in just the span of a couple of days. And this is a serious devaluation. It just sounds like numbers, but this means that one day you have, a certain amount of money, the next day that money is worth a significant amount less. But again, this then is reflected in the prices of things, because people say, okay, it seems like the economy is going off the rails. I think I need to raise prices because I'm not going to be able to make as much as I was making before. And so this is added to a situation where many different sectors are being impacted by Milei's cuts of, for example, in the different departments, people losing their jobs, the mass layoffs that have been happening. All of these measures, which he said were going to alleviate economic stress in the economy, have not done so. And so now he's going back to the IMF, taking out more debt, $12 billion of debt, and essentially pleading to kind of these big capitalists, like, okay, I've gotten more dollars in the country. I'm eliminating this kind of cap on the exchange rate. Hopefully things will go well. But again, this is a really short-term solution, because once those $12 billion, that's the first disbursement, the $12 billion, runs out, they're going to face another issue of not having enough dollars in the country, not being able to sustain the exchange rate with the peso. And once again, Argentina is going to be further indebted. Milei is unwilling to take other measures to really kind of make people's lives better in the country. Don't even talk about nationalizing any of the industries, which Alberto Fernandez was also unable to do, to really challenge big capital in the country. But again, the solutions that he has come up with, which is austerity policies, which is cutting education, which is cutting pensions, which is cutting people's jobs, still not working. This IMF loan is not going to solve any of these long-term problems, and people are just going to be further indebted. Again, foreign debt is one of the biggest issues facing economies of the global south. It's always the people who have to pay these. And so he may be given this short-term solution right now, but it is not going to help the Argentinian people in the long term. And Milei is not going to be able to run away from this economic crisis.
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. Let me just ask you this quickly before we let you go here. Related but sort of separate issue. I mean, the issue also of currency valuations in Latin America is a tricky issue. I mean, there's, this website Dollar Blue that's, quotes the exchange rate between the peso in Argentina and the dollar, also Venezuela. You were telling me there's actually more of these websites out here, but it's relevant because no one really knows like who these people are, what they're doing. I personally, and I'll say it, just me, tinfoil hat, that I thought Dollar Blue was the CIA, because then, they're often quoted then by the Federal Reserve of the United States. So that means the whole world is adopting these kind of made up valuations that have a huge impact on how policies play and can be used to really undermine governments, as they have been in Argentina a number of times.
Yeah, I mean, we are living in an age where the economies of the global south are dominated by the dollar. And I think it's really hard for people in the United States to actually understand what that means, because we live with the security of the dollar. Our wages are not impacted by the, whether or not our currency kind of falls with regards to the dollar. But the fact that, the dollar blue is kind of an insane construction, and has been happening for the past couple of months in Argentina is that you see the Argentina central bank has set a certain exchange rate, the dollar blue continues to grow. And so at a certain point, you have to say, okay, this is fictitious. This is what people are buying the dollar at. And, these governments in the end are forced to kind of make peace with what the informal market is saying about how much their currency is worth. And I think it really underscores the fact that when we live in an international financial system that's dominated by the dollar, where countries, even if they have their own sovereign currency, have to tender in the dollar. They have to have a certain reserve of dollars in order for them to do international trade, in order to pay their international debt. This means that everything depends on their ability to get dollars. And this means that certain players in the economy are going to have more power. For example, in Argentina, it's the soy exporters, which are able to, get the biggest amount of dollars because they're, the biggest exporter. This means that they have kind of an outsized role in what happens in Argentina's economy. This means that, whether or not they export and get dollars impacts then, if people's salaries are going to change. And I think what's interesting is that last week at the Dilemmas of Humanity conference in Sao Paulo, these discussions, not just about this kind of, hot topic concept of de-dollarization, but what does it actually mean to make economies that are sovereign and independent from the power of the dollar? Because it's impossible for the global South to actually have its own independent financial and political path and ability to, advance their economies, to make, material conditions better for their people if they're constantly dealing with a currency that is not their own and that they don't actually have any power over. The US can print as many dollars as it wants and shore up its own economy. The countries of the global South do not have that same luxury, yet their economy depends on it.
Absolutely. Well, the good news is you can follow all of this at peoplesdispatch.org.
Yes, please follow us at People's Dispatch on all social media platforms and our website, peoplesdispatch.org.
Okay, I got scared it was a .com and I messed it up. You had a great video, by the way, about the Dilemmas of Humanities conference. Great wrap-up of that multi-day event that I hope people check out in addition to Argentina, Sri Lanka, and every other country on earth. Zoe, you are the editor of People Dispatch. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Rania, I just realized something that I forgot to say earlier before we go to our next guest that I do want to say before I move on, because we did have Ruweida on earlier from Gaza, who's a journalist. And of course, just to offer a remembrance for our colleague Wafa Al-Udaini, who was killed along with her husband and 2 children in Gaza in the course of this genocide, who was a journalist and was out constantly covering different things and lost her life in the genocide. So I did just want to mention Wafa as well, since we had raised that issue. So sorry to go back a few stories, but I realized I'd forgotten to say that, so I wanted to say it.
No, I actually think about her often, Wafat and her family, who were killed a few months ago after enduring over a year of genocide, just disgusting, horrible insanity. And, I think often of all the of everybody in Gaza, but just the fact that journalists and their entire families are fair game for the Israeli government. And it's completely supported by our tax dollars. So it's just a horrifying situation.
Indeed it is. Well, you mentioned at the top of the show, Rania, the huge amount of propaganda that we are all subject to, and we want to talk about one aspect of that, which is propaganda. Great new book out by Alec Karakastanis called Propaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. I was able to talk to him a little bit earlier today about the book Propaganda, what it all means, and how it led to some of our current moments. So we'll hear from Alec now. And as we keep the show going, we want to turn to really one of the crucially important issues in this country, and that's, of course, what everyone's talking about, the rise of authoritarian rule under the Trump administration, but the deep roots of that and how it connects to many of the struggles we've seen around policing over the past several decades. So we are super, super honored to be joined for this conversation by Alec Karakastanis, who's a civil rights attorney, the founder of the Civil Rights Corps, but most importantly for today, the author of of the newly released book, Propaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Very excited about this text. Alec, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here on the show. And I guess I'll just start. I often ask people who write books this first question of why now? I mean, obviously the issue of misinformation by the police is a long-running issue in our society and in our struggles, as we've discussed before on this show. So what about this moment made coming out with this text, Propaganda, so important for you?
No, I've been really approaching this as a civil rights lawyer and as a lawyer representing some of the most vulnerable populations in our society. Our work has, we've sued jails and prisons and police and prosecutors and judges all over the country. We've helped get hundreds of thousands of people out of jail cells in this country. And we've been really at the forefront of fighting against arbitrary and illegal detention, detention before trial, the criminalization of poverty. And as we were going around the country in all of these places, I've been somewhat alarmed by the role that institutions that portray themselves or even think of themselves as liberal and progressive, like news outlets and professors and universities and nonprofit organizations, the extent to which those entities are actually contributing to the mythologies and narratives and policies of authoritarianism and sort of the far right turn in this country. And so for me, the last 5 years, particularly the backlash to the uprisings of 2020, were a profound moment where I think all people of goodwill, all ordinary people in our society who want a society of safety and freedom and human flourishing, we have to reckon with the role that a lot of elite liberal institutions and influential people have played in bringing us to this authoritarian moment, in their complicity in accepting a lot of the mythologies and logics of that authoritarian moment. And that's why it felt urgent for me, because I think we're at a very scary, very dangerous time. And many of the people who ordinary people turn to resist are actually a huge part of the problem.
This is such a good point, and I'm glad you raised it. I hate to just single out one outlet, so you could talk about many more than this. But I think about the New York Times, for instance, as I think one of the most widely read newspapers, but has been very much on the crime beat, so to speak, over the past couple years. And certainly in New York City, as a resident of New York City, not currently, but for the past 5 years or so, it played a very big role in shaping people's perceptions that there was like a wave of criminality sweeping the city, and it could only actually be responded to by increasing the number of police officers, which, are big assumptions in and of themselves. But coming from the New York Times, you think, why would I question this?
Absolutely. And that's one of the most important features of this is when it comes from the New York Post or the right-wing police union or the Manhattan Institute or the Republican Party, people are primed to be skeptical about it, right? It's kind of like how the New York Times reports on statements by the Russian government or something like that, right? There's a certain skepticism. But when this thing is being peddled by people who portray themselves as neutral or objective or even progressive and liberal, then people's sort of filters are sort of clogged by this sort of blurriness, where they become a little bit less skeptical, a little bit less able to see clearly the incentives and the bias. And so it's been enormously damaging to have the New York Times really leading the charge in many respects on what is akin to climate science denial, right? So they have been pushing a narrative that there's rising crime at a time when crime in this country, violent crime and property crime, are at at least 40 or 50 and probably even 60-year lows, okay? We don't have great data over the course of history, but it's clear that current reported crime rates are extraordinarily low in this country. The second thing that they're doing, which is even worse, is they are going against all of the empirical evidence to suggest that the solution to all these fears that they've been ginning up is more authoritarian sort of repression, more investment in police prosecution and prisons as the solution to make us safer. So, this is like climate science denial, because all of the available scientific evidence shows that the things that actually cause people to hurt each other, the things that actually cause harm in our society, are deeper structural features of our society, like how unequal it is, access to healthcare, access to housing, the ability to get treatment, the levels of alienation in our society, the lack of investment in places for kids to play and to have fun, and music and theater and dance, and all of these investments that are actually shown to reduce the extent to which people harm each other. Also big things like toxic masculinity and environmental pollution. The exposure of children to lead is highly correlated with future violent crime. So like there's all of these big structural features of our society, and the levels of violence in a society have almost nothing to do with the policies of police, prosecutors, or judges or prisons. And so I think this giant myth, this sort of like big lie that we're constantly being told, is that like little tweaks in how our society handles crime actually affect overall safety. But we know from all of the evidence that if more investment in police, prosecution, and prisons made us safer, we would be the safest society in world history, because we are investing more money than any society has ever attempted to invest in the bureaucracies of state control and surveillance and violence. And we are not the safest society in the world, not even close.
It's astonishing when you lay it out like that. And it makes me wonder, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of different factors here, but, the fact that you isolate the police and the media in terms of how this propaganda is working, I mean, it reminds me of something when I used to be an anti-police brutality organizer in D.C. Our biggest problem was almost always the Washington Post reporter who would report on these issues around policing would also be the person that reported on like crime, as well. So there was always this kind of privileging aspect where we always felt like we were not taken as seriously as the police or whoever it may be. And I know some of this is also just your preconceived notions, manufacturing consent and what Chomsky put out for us for many years. But how much of this is sort of direct, that the relationship between these two entities, like the reporters are in fact privileging certain sources and certain individuals as the ones with knowledge?
Well, I get into this a lot more in the book, and there is some astonishing stuff that people don't know. And the book has hundreds of examples. I also try to make it funny because I think these are really dark topics, and it's very, very important to like have fun where we can. So I give a lot of little fake awards out to a lot of New York Times journalists and others, and I try to come up with examples and ideas that people may not have heard about, and also give people solutions. But I think like the thing that astonished me was digging just a little bit into how much money police are spending behind the scenes to influence every single thing that you consume. It's not just, a lot of people know about the budgets that police and police consultants. By the way, it's not just police. There's a huge consulting industry surrounding the police that consults on every single TV show you've ever seen, music shows, even YouTube shows where they talk about this stuff. It's not just the show Cops. It's not just Law and Order. It's sort of everything that you consume that has a police officer in it. Somebody's consulting on that and shaping how that's portrayed. But in the news, a lot of people don't really appreciate. I've been talking to, dozens and dozens and dozens of news anchors and producers and editors, and the stuff they've told me is astonishing. So they face a lot of pressure every single day to fill their newspaper and to fill their nightly newscast at 6 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. They need content. And police have a multi-billion-dollar national budget to fill the airwaves with that content. They don't just send the arrest reports. They send video. They send charts. They send quotes. They send people to interview, right? They shape. And it's like with all of the divestment from local journalism, it's not even necessarily that a lot of these local journalists want to be doing this. It's just the police make it so easy to just take what they give you and put it on the news. As opposed to think, for example, about teachers' unions or nurses or the people that are testing the water your children are drinking or the soil that your children are playing with, or workplace safety violations, or the people that are like monitoring the horrific living conditions that landlords are subjecting tenants to. None of those people have a budget to tell you about all of the ways in which those powerful groups are harming your safety. And so the point I'm getting at is you can have a situation in this country where 100,000 human beings are killed every year because of air pollution alone. I'm not even getting into the hundreds of thousands of water pollution violations. Most of this stuff is crime. They are literally violating criminal law. And yet, on the local news every night, you're not seeing every single night, the story of this company polluting toxic fumes and all the children that are dying, right? This is 5 times the number of people that die from all homicide combined. It's never showing up on the local news. And why? Because the bureaucrats and the officials who investigate those things don't have the public relations budgets that the police have. And I think a story I tell in the book is when the Chicago police killed Laquan McDonald. At that moment that they covered that up, they had only 4 public relations employees, which is still a lot. They had 4 people whose full-time job was to try to make the Chicago police look good in the media. Today, as I'm talking to you, years after the murder of Laquan McDonald, they have over 50. They have over 50 full-time people in the Chicago Police Department alone dedicated to, I'm not even getting into the NYPD, which is probably about double of the budget of the Chicago Police Department when you add it all up. And again, this is all stuff that we know publicly. There's a lot of stuff going on that we don't even know publicly. So like all of those people are completely and irrevocably changing your brain chemistry. When you consume the news, you're consuming the articles that they spend their entire day shaping for the news media. And I don't think most people are prepared to reckon with what that means about like what kinds of views they develop, what they're scared of, who they're not afraid of at all, what safety means, and then what the solutions for all those problems are.
No, I think that's critically important. And before we let you go, I mean, I just want to speak to this issue of, now, some of us have maybe known some of this for a long time, but because of what's happening with the Trump administration, a lot of people coming out, waking up, looking to push forward. I mean, what are some of the things that you think that this book people should take away from this book in terms of how the concept of, let's say, quote unquote, resistance, to use a buzzword, is conceived of?
I'll say, there's a lot to say about this, and it's a very important moment. And I also want to say, my whole goal here is to just facilitate these conversations and get these ideas out there. So like, I don't make any money from the book. All of the royalties are donated to an amazing charity that works with unhoused people to fight against police surveillance. We also have money so that any teacher who wants to assign any part of the book to their students in high school, college, law school, grad school, and anyone in prison can have a free copy of the book. So this is about getting the ideas out there. So, if you're listening to this, like, get a copy of the book, share it with people that you know. Like, this is really about trying to improve the way in which we think collectively and more critically. And I think that's the main takeaway of the book for me is there are a lot of institutions like news outlets, universities, nonprofits that do a really good job of pretending to care about these issues, that do a really good job of portraying themselves as neutral and objective, but that either intentionally, and I think the case of the New York Times, a lot of what's happening at the highest levels there is quite intentional, but even unintentionally, a lot of the reporters there and a lot of the reporters that I talk to all around the country who've approached me, aren't doing a lot of the stuff intentionally, but there's so much that even they have to learn about the ways in which their reporting furthers and accepts and validates a lot of far right like mythologies about who is dangerous and what threats there are to our safety and what the evidence shows about what kinds of things a society can do to create lower levels of violence. So I think like the main takeaway that I want for people is to like really interrogate so much of what they think of as well-meaning, objective, liberal and progressive news and expertise. I have a whole chapter on the role of Harvard and University of Pennsylvania and NYU and a lot of elite institutions, the role that they play in spreading the sort of faux expertise that's really just laundering right-wing police union talking points for a more liberal audience. It's very important that we actually examine those processes because the propaganda all around us is relentless. And if we're not careful, all of us are very susceptible to it. So we need to start being able to identify it.
Well, the book is Propaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. I couldn't recommend it any higher. Alec, thank you so much for joining us, talking about the book, talking about all these issues, and we'll be talking to you soon, I'm sure.
Thank you so much.
Well, Rania, great interview. Glad we were able to do it. I hope everyone goes out and gets the book, Propaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Fantastic. He's been posting some snippets on his social media, and I can say that it's made me very, very excited to go grab a copy.
Yeah, definitely. Really appreciate Alec's work on this, and I look forward to reading his book.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Rania, that brings us to the end of today's show. Sad time for us, I know, sad time for our viewers. But the good thing is we are here once a week, and there is all sorts of other great content like Dispatches from Rania Khalek you can check out. So make sure you hit subscribe, then hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to. So all of that fantastic content is available to you very easily. Before we get out of here, Rania, are there things you would like our viewers to know?
Yeah, an episode of Dispatches just went up a couple hours ago.
Oh.
It's with Loki, and it's some really juicy stuff, guys. Not just on how much big tech sucks, but also some talk about Douglas Murray and Bari Weiss and the long list of hypocrite free speech warriors who seem to love deportations and genocide.
Yeah.
Anyways, beyond that, I want to remind people that we are an independent media outlet that relies on support from our audience to keep going and growing, because we don't take money from pharmaceutical companies or Lockheed Martin. So if you are able, please go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. And for as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. Most importantly, you can be pitching in to help an independent media outlet that is bringing you the truth in a tsunami of lies. Keep on going and growing, and I'm going to keep saying going and growing because it's my new favorite tagline.
I thought it was good. A tsunami of lies, also
Thank you.
pretty good. You're on fire today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Listen, look, I'm with it. I'm 100% with it. This is part of the reason why you should continue to contribute and watch us, because look at how sharp and intelligent Rania is. Don't you want that every day?
Oh, thank you.
You do. One way to make it happen, patreon.com/breakthrough news. But big shout out to all our existing patrons. Huge thanks to all of you, everything you've done. Big shout out to all our guests today. Shout out to everyone here at Breakthrough News who makes the show possible. Shout out to all of you who are watching. For myself, for our team here, for Rania Khalek, we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.